Okay. Right, bear with me. Okay. Can everyone see my slides or is it on presenter mode? Is that all good? Yeah. Neil, someone can you let me know? So yeah, great. Okay, bore da pawb. Fel wedes i, croeso mawr i chi gyd. Mae'n sesiwn diogelu gweithwyr proffesiynol tai rhag risg hunanladdiad. Good morning and a very warm welcome to you all to our webinar, Protecting Housing Professionals from Suicide Risk. Sorry, bear with me, my fire alarm again. So today's session is for North Wales only. Don't worry if you are from another region. It's just how we split them. We're not going to kick you off or anything. It's absolutely fine. And it's so lovely to see so many of you on this session. We've had a really, really promising uptake so far for this. So, yn gynta, we're really pleased to announce that this project has been funded by the NHS Wales Performance Improvement Team, and we're very grateful for them to allow us to sort of get this work going. It was something that started off from just a conversation between us at TPAS Cymru and the Samaritans Cymru, and I think it's such a strong partnership because we're bringing together the sort of tenant voice expertise and working with our members in the housing sector that TPAS Cymru have, and then that expertise that Samaritans Cymru have in terms of listening and preventing suicide. And that goes without saying then that there is a trigger warning. We are going to be talking about some sensitive topics today, and we completely understand that for many that can bring up some quite difficult and challenging emotions. So if this is the case, you need to take a break, you need to step away from the computer, then please do so. Your well-being is really paramount. Also, if you could all just put in the chats where you're from, ble chi'n dod, a pam rydych chi yma, where you're from and why you're here today, that would be really, really lovely. Because it's always nice to see who's on this session, why you're here, what you're hoping to get out of it. So just a couple o reolau I ddechrau, just some things to start. We do encourage the chat use. Hopefully you can all use that and see it and access it. We're not really using the Q&A feature because we want this to be quite free-flowing, and off the back of that, we don't want anyone to feel like there are any stupid questions. So if you do have a question that you want to ask, please just pop it in and we'll endeavour to pick it up as we go along. Rhywbeth arall o ran yr iaith Gymraeg, dwi yn annog i chi ofyn cwestiynau trwy gyfrwng y Gymraeg, os mae hynna yn rhywbeth rydych chi moyn, mwy na hapus i drafod yn y Gymraeg ac i hybu'r iaith hefyd. Also, we will be collating feedback from this session, and I say it at the start, mainly as a reminder to ourselves as well to put the feedback in, but also that we will be collecting this at the end, and we'd really appreciate it if you could fill that in with your perspectives on how this session went. And as I mentioned, it will also be recorded, so we're going to send this out to members, and you can also pass it on to your colleagues as well, just to make sure that we're really spreading out the message as far and wide as we can. So, a couple of ddisgwyliadau o'r session hon, some expectations from this session. So I just think it's really important to outline these while we start. I also didn't introduce myself, by the way. I am Olivia and I work for TPAS Cymru. I always forget to do that bit. I'm the Policy and Engagement Officer. And with this session, it's all about professionals, whether you're from the trades kind of element of professions in housing or your frontline housing staff, everyone's welcome here. And what we want to do is provide accessible, free information on suicide risk within the housing sector to really raise that awareness. This is not an in-depth training session on suicide prevention, and I just wanted to make that clear. Samaritans do offer training for this, and they will share their details about this after, and there will be some handouts emailed via myself post-session, so some lovely guides that they have just to make sure that we're really driving these conversations forwards. Now, I know our aim is essentially to build a housing sector with reduced suicide risk. We want a housing sector where everyone plays a role in this and that we can have these really difficult conversations because this might be something you've come across in your line of work. It might be something perhaps you've experienced on a personal level or someone close to you. You might have been dealing with tenants, colleagues, co-workers. And we want to really make sure that we are talking about this as a subject because it does start with talking and also listening, which is something that We've got Susan to sort of go into more in depth on this from the Samaritans, and also Neil a bit as well, and Katrina. And as you can kind of gather, as I mentioned at the start, we're kind of just touching the tip of the iceberg here. We know that suicide is a very complex thing, and that, it's not something we can cover in an hour-long session today, but it's what we can see and we're talking about. So we're going to go into a little bit more of that. But obviously, as I mentioned, it's important to understand that there are so many factors behind this, which Neil will go into. But it does start here. It starts with listening and it starts with talking and kind of trying to break down that stigma as well. Something else I just wanted to touch upon is that link between public health and housing, and also suicide. So suicide is a public health issue. Similarly to housing, we know that housing has huge links with public health and that all these kind of factors can intersect. And the reason we're doing this project is partly because, particularly when we talk about social housing, is that a lot of staff and tenants can often work in areas that are quite deprived. They can live in these areas. We're not doing this to sort of cast a dark cloud on social housing per se and say that, it's all gloom and doom. Not saying that at all. And there are many other risks that come into suicide that Neil will go into. But it's just important to kind of see it as part of this model of health. And this is a picture of the social model of health here. And you can kind of see how many different factors really influence people's health overall. And particularly when we look at, general socioeconomic, cultural and environmental conditions, that doesn't just mean people's income. That can mean the food they eat. It can mean the types of communities that they live in. And it's all quite complex. So it's just important to not kind of cast a negative mindset on this or think about stereotyping. It's kind of viewing it in a really holistic way that's really important. And another reason why we're doing this and we wanted to do webinars for professionals and tenants is because we know that a lot of you as staff, whether you're working in the trades or you're working, in housing, you're kind of on that front line, it's quite impactful and it has a negative impact on you when you're dealing with these things. And these are just some of the things that can come up when we talk about suicide risk within housing. When you're dealing with this, it does have an impact on you as well. And just some of those are things like stress, PTSD, anxiety, shame, depression, panic. You might sometimes feel like, oh my gosh, what am I doing? I don't know what to say. I don't know what to do. And this is essentially to try and help to empower the housing community as a whole to try and tackle some of these issues. So I'm going to hand you over to Neil now. And I will stop sharing my screen, but diolch yn fawr am ddod heddiw. Thank you all for coming, and yeah, let's make a start. Thanks.
Good morning all. Thanks, Olivia. My name's Neil Ingham. I'm the Director of Samaritans in Wales, Samaritans Cymru. I'll just bring up my slides and then I'll get started. Give me a second. You see those?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so yeah, just a bit of background. As Olivia said, it's born of conversation with TPAS recently, and the fact that as Samaritans, we know that there's a particular need to address suicide risk in the housing sector. I know the housing sector a bit myself. I worked for 10 years for Pobl, I think now Coddy Group. I think there's someone from Coddy in the session today. So I'm pretty familiar with the housing sector, and obviously, housing does a lot of different things. The sector as a whole, I think from the outside is quite misunderstood, but you will all know that across the span of, social homes, new homes, supported housing, and all the variants of that, the different kind of customer tenant groups that you work with, through to care and support as well. The housing sector does so much. And so when we talk about risk in the housing sector, we're talking about a sector that serves a huge number of people across Wales in lots of different contexts, and which is a really large employer. So we're really pleased we're doing this work. And we're going to talk about suicide, as Olivia said. This project's funded by the NHS Performance and Improvement Suicide Prevention Programme for a small grant that's really just allowed us to do this piece of work over the next few weeks, both with professionals and tenants, and to test the water really, to see what the demand in the sector is, to take your feedback after these sessions and decide where we go next. We've had huge demand for these sessions, which I think speaks to the fact that a lot of people in housing recognise the need to do much more on suicide prevention. The same trigger warning as Olivia, suicide, there's very few people who aren't affected by it in some way. So if you need to check out, you need to take a minute, just do that. We're not expecting to see everybody on the call the whole way through if they need to take 5 minutes. So suicide is a really complex issue, and it's also an issue which is still heavily stigmatized. I'm just trying to move my slides in the background. Why won't it let me do that? There we go. So it's still really heavily stigmatized, and some of the stigmas around suicide and some of the myths that still pervade are really problematic and are barriers to people thinking about prevention. So one of the myths is that suicide or somebody taking their own life is a selfish act. And you will often even hear people who are bereaved by suicide talk about their loved one who's died and say, well, how could they do this? And I think, if you look at the psychology of people who are suicidal, and many people in their lives can reach a point where they feel suicidal, it's anything but a selfish act. It's usually often framed as the individual will say that if they remove themselves from the world, that they will make life better for other people. Suicide psychologically is usually born of pain and difficulty. I'll touch upon that a bit more later on. People sometimes will see suicide as inevitable. So after somebody dies by suicide, often you will hear people say, oh, well, of course, this had happened to them, or they were in a really bad way because of this, or, there's a sense that, we couldn't really have stopped it. Now, on the one hand, there will always be suicides which, nobody was able to prevent, and we should never feel like a personal guilt for failing to prevent the suicide of somebody we know in our life, be that a friend, a colleague, or anybody else, a family member. But there is so much scope for prevention. Suicide or feeling suicidal is typically a temporary state that people can be moved beyond. So the focus of what I'll share later on in terms of the prevention work Samaritans does is on getting people beyond those thoughts and feelings of planning or thinking about suicide. And some of the really simple things that we can do as we do as Samaritans on our helpline, to get people taking charge of their situation and seeing a future beyond the current feelings that they might be feeling. Suicide, paradoxically, whilst it's obviously tragic, can sometimes be romanticized, particularly in the media, particularly when you have a celebrity suicide or a kind of rock and roll suicide. It's anything but romantic. People who are suicidal are dealing with pain, with trauma, and are leading very difficult lives that are in a state of absolute crisis at the point where they might be suicidal. And it's really important to recognize that. So, on the one hand, to recognize the crisis people are in, but on the other hand, to recognize the potential for anybody to move beyond that state. And finally, the S word, by which I mean suicide. There's often a fear to say the word, and that's understandable. It can still be something of a taboo. And specifically, people can be afraid to say to somebody who's in crisis and to ask them whether they are thinking about suicide. But all the evidence we have as Samaritans is that we shouldn't be afraid of talking about suicide at sort of societal level within our organizations, and that we shouldn't be afraid to ask somebody who's in crisis whether they've thought about suicide. Because if they have thought about suicide, they'll tell you that, and it will probably be a relief to them to be able to talk about that. And it allows them to start to explore and open up their feelings around that. So we'll come back to later on some of the practical things we can do to have those types of conversations. And Susan, my colleague, will build on that later. So just to say, before I go into some of the kind of facts and figures and data around suicide, which can often feel quite cold, suicide is a human tragedy. And as I said, in my job, I meet people constantly across Wales and all walks of life. And there's very few people you meet who don't have some sort of direct connection to suicide, who haven't been affected by it. And part of that because any suicide has a sort of huge ripple effect across quite a wide community, typically over 100 people significantly affected by a suicide. So if you lose somebody in your workplace, that will be felt right across the workplace, obviously across family and peer networks. And we see that in Wales in particular. We've worked with the farming community in recent years, and it can be a suicide of somebody in North Wales. Within a week or so, that will be talked about in South Wales because you have those connections and community networks through the marts and through their kind of peer networks in those industries and sectors that mean that those suicides are really felt right across the nation. At the same time, in numbers, whilst there's far too many suicides, there are circa 400 a year in Wales. and we've probably seen a rise in recent years. But I think public perception of the numbers of suicide is quite a complex thing. So a few years ago in Wales, about 3 years ago, we would have said that there were three suicides, death by suicide in a given year for every one death by road traffic collision. And we would say that to highlight and to bring to public attention the fact that there were probably more suicides than people would typically think. Um, Now in 2026, we can say that there are 5 times more suicides than there are deaths by road traffic collision. And there's two reasons for that, and it speaks to why I've got the 20 mile an hour picture on the sign. And this is particularly pertinent in Wales because we've all talked about and thought about the 20 mile an hour speed limit so much in recent years. So that gap has got wider and it's become 5 to 1 rather than 3 to 1 because we've had more suicides, a slight rise in the number of suicides, not a huge rise, but a slight rise in the last few years in Wales. And we've also seen death by road traffic collision come down. In part, it would appear because of the introduction of 20 mile an hour speed limit, and that's a great thing. Um, so that gap has widened, and I think that would surprise a lot of people that there are so many more suicides in Wales of deaths by suicide than there are deaths by road traffic collision. But it's also worth thinking about the wider picture around that. So we would say suicide prevention needs to be a public health issue. We need to treat it as a public health issue in the same way that we do prevention of road deaths or prevention of deaths by smoking. And if you think of all the things that are in place to prevent deaths on the roads, so yes, speed limits, speed cameras, all the stuff on the roads, all those markings and signs, our cars, the regulations around car design, all the safety features in cars, the things we do as individual drivers to learn to be and to proactively be safe drivers. The campaigns around road safety, the penalties for breaches of road rules, for drink driving, for speeding. There's so much in place, and quite rightly so, to prevent those deaths. And then you look at suicide prevention, and there's really nothing specific in place, very little specifically in place. And often suicide prevention just gets wrapped up in broader kind of mental health support. So I really want you to hold that and think about as professionals, as organizations, and as citizens, how we can start to close the gap in terms of what's there in terms of prevention and hopefully close the gap in terms of that discrepancy in numbers. I can't talk about all the specific data around suicide, but we know a lot, particularly in recent years, about who dies by suicide in Wales in a given year. We have annual ONS data, and then we have real-time reporting of suspected suicides. So we can be quite granular now on a quarterly basis at looking at who has died by suicide and what their background is and what the circumstances might be. So on the one hand, anybody can die by suicide, and again, I will meet people bereaved by suicide from all walks of life in Wales, all kinds of circumstances. Um, but there's some clear trends, and there's some very clear kind of risk factors that you can correlate to increased suicide risk. And I've on the slide, I haven't got time to go through all of these, but highlight some of these. And I think working in the housing sector, you'll quickly see if you look at the slide some of the reasons why the communities that you might support and the individuals you might support in particular services and housing, you will see elevated suicide risk. So gender, just to say 3/4 of suicides are male, probably talk all day about that, and that's pretty common in most countries. Age, you see certain patterns of risk. So the sort of highest volume of suicides in Wales would be kind of middle age or men in their 30s up to middle age. But you'll see pockets of increased risk, a pocket of heightened risk at very old age, very isolated people. And in terms of self-harm, for example, in recent years, we've seen very high rates of self-harm, which itself is a big risk factor for suicide amongst young females. Different jobs and employment sectors have different risk factors. So a couple to pick out. The very highest risk factors are in the ONS classified non-employment, people who aren't in employment. And it's worth holding that because often the focus is on particular employment sectors. But people who aren't employed, people who are kind of outside the employment world are at highest risk by some distance. After that, then you're looking at things like construction and trades and manual labor and low paid roles. Like care workers, support workers, which obviously speaks to the housing sector. People who are victims of and perpetrators of abuse. So victims of domestic abuse, you will see, I think yesterday there was quite a lot of coverage nationally, UK nationally, around the very high rates of suicide amongst victims of domestic abuse, but also perpetrators of those crimes. So it's a really difficult challenge in terms of thinking about how you do prevention across that really complex kind of victim perpetrator space. Substance misuse, poverty, I should pick out as absolutely key. So the rates of suicide in the wealthiest areas of Wales, wealthiest electoral wards areas, are 10 times less than they are in the poorest. And you will know as a sector, as a housing sector, where you tend to work and where you tend to support tenants. Access to means, people bereaved by suicide at increased risk, neurodiversity, and a range of other risk factors. But beyond all those risk factors, it's worth thinking of suicide in simple terms as being the product of a kind of unbearable symphony of pain in somebody's life. So we all have a kind of symphony of pain and joy, I would say, in our lives to varying extents. We all have our different life experiences and we experience good things and bad things. Um, there's a really good academic, Susie Bennett, who's done lots of work on male suicide, who talks about this notion of a symphony of pain. And if you think of the traumatic or the painful events in somebody's lives, maybe a difficult childhood, or experience of abuse, isolation, poverty, ill health, relationship breakdown, all these moments in somebody's lives that can kind of add a soundtrack of pain in their life, and that building up over time, and particularly if they're not doing the right things to get themselves supported, or if they're doing negative things to kind of regulate that pain, substance misuse, self-harm, for example, that symphony just gets louder and louder to a point where it becomes unbearable. And psychologically, suicide momentarily might seem like a sensible plan, and it might seem like a way out of that pain. So it's really useful thinking about, if you're supporting somebody in your life or working with a client or working with a tenant, and you kind of hear that symphony of pain in the things they're telling you. You feel that sense of a life that just has too much noise, too much pain in it, and the sense that they can't cope and that's becoming unbearable. I think that's when your radar around potential suicide risk needs to be very live. Specific few words about men, they are at higher risk, and just to say that I could talk all day about male suicide risk and the challenges around that. Again, Susie Bennett, that academic from Scotland, who's really focused on this. I think her thinking, as best as I can relay it quickly, is that men and women who experience similar challenges in life will have similar symphonies of pain going on in their lives. But her theory is that men are kind of don't so much struggle to reach out, but maybe feel a heavier external burden in terms of some of the things they need to live up to and societal expectations around male norms. And so it's really important when thinking about male suicide that we don't treat men as one homogenous group, or women for that matter. And I think there's been a tendency to do that in the mental health and suicide prevention space. I have the picture of the rugby player here because if you're a man, you struggle to go into a pub toilet in recent years and not have a poster in front of you, typically of a rugby player, usually holding a ball, telling you to reach out, telling you that it's tougher to talk or it takes balls to talk, those types of campaigns that sort of well-intentioned, but try and in this really muddled way tell men that we need to be emotional beings and that doing that is the tough thing to do, the manly thing to do. And so what we do is we reinforce those kind of problematic expectations of masculinity. So I'd really like to challenge that. We did that in a campaign last year at Samaritans that recognised that both men and women do tend to reach out. And the evidence base shows that men and women in the year before they die by suicide, in fairly equal measures, do go and see their GP, do speak to mental health professionals, do talk to people. But actually, the response is inadequate. So the focus needs to be much more on what happens when somebody reaches out. And from a male perspective, what males can do to support each other, perhaps, rather than just putting the onus on the individual to sort of toughen up and talk or be a man and talk. Housing and risk, I've touched on, this is a map of the areas of multiple deprivation in Wales. And, you'll know the correlations between location of social homes and location of supported housing schemes you operate and areas of deprivation. And those broader risk factors that many of your tenant and client groups will be experiencing in lives. And I'm conscious, the support services you run will often overtly support people who are, say, fleeing domestic violence or have come out of the criminal justice system or are, substance misusing. Those risk factors are very high in some of those services. And then as an employer, the hard hat, construction and trades workforce has an elevated suicide risk. In fact, running these sessions and speaking to people from housing associations as we've run these sessions, I've had a number of people directly say, yes, we lost a colleague last year, or there's somebody in our housing association in the trades team who took their own life in recent years. And you may well know people yourselves who've taken their lives in those spaces. And I talked about those, aside from the suicide risk, just the pressures and the challenges that as workforces in the housing sector you face, supporting people whose lives are complex, who are often in crisis, that is a huge burden. So understanding suicide and feeling more empowered to be able to help and not necessarily fix people's problems, but be able to do something useful to help prevent suicide is really important. And prevention is possible. So Samaritans as a charity exists to prevent suicide. The, on the slide, you'll see some stats about our helpline, which has been operating, I think, for 72 years now, 71, 72 years. Amazing service delivered by incredible volunteers who day and night across 10 branches in Wales, about 200 branches across the UK, are there on the phones to listen to people. And I don't mind admitting, I find it pretty amazing that in 2026, in a world of digital technology, we get so many phone calls from people of all ages, day and night, because people really want to be listened to. We offer an anonymous, non-judgmental service. We don't therapize, we don't seek to fix people's problems. We listen, and our listeners are really skilled at helping people explore their thoughts and feelings and get them to a better place at the end of the call. And listening is at the heart of what Samaritans does. And we know from the feedback from callers that being listened to makes a huge difference. And in some cases will be the difference between people having a plan to take their own life and being able to move beyond that. That permeates the other work we do, that concept of listening and empowering people to, as professionals and individuals, to make interventions. So this is a really low quality picture of our work on the rail network. So we work with Network Rail and Transport for Wales across the UK because there's a high suicide risk on the railways and also because the workforce is really affected by suicide. So we do a whole bunch of things. We work with them around design and access to the rail infrastructure. We work with staff teams affected by witnessing suicidal incidents to support them because of their heightened suicide risk. And we also empower the workforce to intervene, start conversations and intervene in situations where they think somebody on the rail network might be at suicidal risk. And that's hugely impactful. We did a study of that service over the last 10 years that showed it was through direct interventions, we were preventing around 300 suicides a year, which isn't far short of the number of suicides we see in Wales in a given year. We work in prisons as well. And I highlight this because we work in every UK prison, have done for many years. It actually started in Wales, our prison listener scheme in Swansea, where volunteers go in and train teams of people in prisons, male and female prisons, to provide a peer support listening service, so a Samaritans listening service within the prison, because there's very high self-harm and suicide rates in prisons. It brings huge benefits for everybody, both the people receiving the service and providing it. But it also really shows the power of peer networks and the potential of providing peer support in any kind of environment. And frankly, if you can do it in a prison, you can do it anywhere. Every UK prisoner also has a kind of direct line to the Samaritans helpline as well. So we take a high volume of calls from prisons. So what next? What for the housing sector? So there's no easy answers, but we wanted to start the conversation with the sector and show the potential of prevention. My suggestions would be that we can all, as individuals, as citizens, as family members, and as colleagues and professionals, we can all become awesome listeners, or certainly better listeners. I was a pretty rubbish listener when I started working for Samaritans a few years ago. I'm a better listener now, and that pays dividends in all aspects of my life. And we can all learn to become better listeners. Even a little bit of learning can take us quite a way forward. And if we really get stuck into some proper Samaritans training around listening, let alone became a Samaritans listener and do all the training it takes to become a fully fledged Samaritan, you'd be really well placed to help people in moments of crisis. And we talk a lot in Samaritans in Wales about imagining a Wales of great listeners. There's always so much focus in society on communication, on being a great public speaker or networker, but so much less focus on listening, and the two need to go together. And we need to meet that demand. There's so much demand for people who are reaching out, who are sharing their problems, but there's so little capacity in formal services and in social and employment settings to actually meet that demand. And listening can do that. Interruption, so feeling empowered and feeling confident to have suicide conversations, to say the word suicide, to interrupt when you're worried about somebody. We know from speaking to people with lived experience that being interrupted at a time when they're feeling suicidal or somebody connecting with them in those dark moments can really make a difference and can move them beyond that suicidality, which again often is a temporary state of mind. And as a sector, seeking to build resilience and put the energy and the resource in and build those skills where the risk is highest. So, like as ever, we can't fight every battle, but we can really focus down on where we need to put our attention in terms of supporting staff teams, working with tenant groups who are at the highest risk, because that offers our best route to prevention, accepting that, as I said earlier, in any given year, all kinds of people can die by suicide, but we do know there's some really clear risk profiles. And we as a charity can, help you and help you understand your local area. And the NHS has got a team of regional coordinators across Wales who can help any organisation understand the risk profile in the area in which you work as a housing association. And thinking about peer-powered support, what can you put in place in your schemes, in your services, in your staff teams that create peer networks who can better listen to and support each other? Because it's tremendously powerful. There's also now a BSI standard for organizations who want to become excellent at suicide prevention, really speaks the language of large organizations, businesses, industry, and takes suicide prevention away from being something that can often feel quite of an emotional issue and brings it into a practical issue that an organization can become excellent at. So we can help you along that journey, but the standard is free for people to download. It's a free BSI standard, so you can go and take a look at that and then, challenge your organization to progress that standard. So I'll stop waffling because I need to listen more than I talk. But thank you for listening. That's just a skim over a whole bunch of themes. And I'm going to hand over to Susan from our STEP training team.
Great. Thank you, Neil. I'm just going to share the slides for Susan. Bear with me a second, everyone. Okay. Right. Let me know when you can see them. I still need to get quicker at this. This is my main aim, I think, is to get really speedy. Hang on, bear with me. Take a minute. My laptop's quite slow. Okay. Can you see the screens or are they on presenter mode?
They're not on presenter mode at the moment.
Okay.
We can just put full screen.
There we go. Is that better? Yeah. Is that all right, Susan?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Fantastic. No worries.
Okay. Great. So thank you, Neil. So my name's Susan Craft. I work in the Samaritans Training and Engagement Programs team at our central office, and I work with many, many organisations supporting their training and education programs. So if you move on to the next slide, Olivia, thank you. So what we'll explore today in our short session this morning, just give you a short overview of the Samaritans training and the customers that we work with, why suicide prevention is so important and how it can save lives, and then just touch briefly on active listening using the Samaritans listening wheel and our shush tips. Okay, so for over 70 years, we've been training our Listen volunteers to provide vital emotional support to many, many people who use our service. STEP draws on the expertise gained from our support services to provide training and learning options to organisations across all sectors. It equips staff with the skills and confidence to support their colleagues, customers and service users. At Samaritans, we believe that any life lost to suicide is a tragedy. Prevention and early intervention are key to reducing suicide. And we can help to do this through teaching these skills to more people in the workplace, to recognise the risk factors earlier and provide effective support. Suicide is everyone's business and everyone can harness the power of listening. Samaritans listening skills is at the heart of our training programme. It helps to increase people's confidence to prevent suicide and provide in the moment support and aftercare for themselves and others. Our next slide just gives a couple of examples of some of our training courses. So one of our flagship courses, Managing Suicidal Conversations, it looks at background factors and feelings that can lead to suicide thoughts. It recognises direct and indirect signs of suicide ideation. It helps to develop the skills to manage a suicidal conversation with someone sensitively and effectively. And it helps you explore strategies to assess and respond to risk. And really importantly, it gives signs of sources of support for you if you're having those conversations, and for your colleagues and work colleagues. So another one of our courses is Conversations with Vulnerable People. So looking at more general vulnerabilities, which again can include suicide, but looking more broadly across a range of vulnerabilities. It helps to look at emotional health and using what we here call at Samaritans our emotional health scale. It recognises signs of vulnerability in others, and it helps you as an attendee to see those signs of vulnerability and recognise those signs. It explores and practices active listening skills, and it helps you look at how to end conversations sensitively and effectively. Again, also looking at signposting. Then just another example, our listening skills course. This focuses purely on the listening skills, what you can do to have that really, really key, important conversation. Our training is practical and hands-on, and when included, we work with you as a customer to tailor scenarios for our skills practice sessions, making the training really, really relevant to your organisation. And we offer a range of open courses for organisations who don't need that in-house training or want to experience training before rolling out to our colleagues. And we also have an extensive programme of in-house courses. So what do our customers say about us? If you can just, so 99% of our participants would recommend STEP training to others, something that we're incredibly proud of here at Samaritans. So we work with housing associations such as Sovereign Network Group, A2 Dominion, Porchlight. We work with charities including Trussell and Age UK. We work with banks and building societies such as Barclays, the Building Society Association, supporting vulnerable customer teams. We also work across the MOD, working with the RAF and the Royal Navy, helping support their suicide prevention strategy. And we work with many other public sector organisations, including the police, several councils and local authorities. So our STEP portfolio. So our portfolio includes a range of products and services to support organisations, train their staff, and to support staff and customers and support their suicide prevention strategies. We work closely in partnership with our customers to support suicide prevention. As Neil mentioned earlier, the BSI, British Standards Institution, have just recently launched a new standard. So we can work with organisations to help implement these standards. Their training does come at a cost, but it's typically for not-for-profit organisations, ranging between sort of £1,000 for a webinar, up to £2,100 for a one-day course. And say we have lots and lots of different interventions to support your need at any particular time for your organisation. We have just started, since the release of the BSI standards, working with organisations to support them implement their suicide prevention strategies. So some really, really important work that we're very, very proud to be doing. So I'm going to move on now to active listening, which Neil mentioned earlier. He actually said there that he wasn't a very good listener when he started at Samaritans. I'm very much in the same place. When I started at Samaritans, I thought I was a good listener, but I learned incredibly quickly that that wasn't the case. So just going to ask a couple of short questions. If you want to put your answers in chat, that would be great. So do you think you're a good listener? And then, sort of depending on that, what skills do you think is needed to be a good listener? It's interesting, the bit about that listening bit. When I thought I was a good listener, I used to try and solve everybody's problems for them. I think being a solution driven in my work, I sort of put that into my listening, and as I say, I very, very quickly found out that really wasn't the right way to have effective listening. Yeah, absolutely. Time. Yeah, absolutely. Patience and time. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Don't make it about yourself. Yeah, that was my downfall. I thought I was being really helpful, but I was very, very far from it. Not interrupting. Yeah, great. Yeah, some lovely ideas there. Absolutely spot on. So we have sort of barriers to listening. There can be distractions that can be external and internal. Our own emotional state, if we're not in a good place, perhaps it's not the best time to have a conversation with someone. You might let some of your previous experiences cloud those discussions that you're having. And I think, one of the one that comes up quite a lot, we want to solve people's problems and we want to give advice and we want to manage the situation, which it really isn't about. In our step training, we use a tool called the listening wheel, which is a tried and tested model which we use when we're training our listening volunteers. We've also got our shush tips, which is what we're going to explore today. So that's shush tips. It's a really nice, easy acronym to remember. So before we start on a conversation, it's really important to take a minute to just have a think through about what we should be considering when we are starting that conversation. So choose a good time and be somewhere without distractions. Think about what might be going on for you at the moment. Is it really a good time for you to be having a conversation to support another individual if perhaps you're not in the best place? We should be thinking about that listening and showing empathy. We've also talked earlier about thinking about not giving your view. It really, really is about listening and taking time for that listening. And I think above all, when you are starting out with those conversations, it shows that you care and that you really want to listen. So if we just move on now, I'm just going to take you briefly through the shush tips. So S, show that you care. Focus on the other person. Make eye contact. Put your phone away. There's nothing worse than sort of people putting their phone at the forefront of everything that they do. So this really is about you giving your time to give time to this person, colleague, friend, who you really are wanting to be there to support. Have patience. It takes time and it might take a few attempts before someone is ready to open up. So that's absolutely fine. Don't worry about rushing through. Show that you've got that time and that patience. Use open questions that need more than a yes or no answer. You don't actually want to sort of shut that person down. So try something like, how are you feeling today? And then follow up with, tell me more. Give them time to think about what they might want to share with you. And again, it's about using those open questions so you're not closing down or giving them an opportunity to close down the situation. It's really important when you're having these conversations to absolutely show that you are there in the moment with the person that you're having, that you're listening to. I'm not going to say having a conversation because it's more about you listening to them and giving them time to talk. So if you use their language back and sort of go say it back to them, that really demonstrates that you have actually been listening and that you're understanding what they're saying. So you can use that as a mechanism to check back that you've understood, but don't interrupt. Don't offer a solution, as we've said here, that sometimes that's what we all just go into, that solution driven mode. And I think, again, that's also parcel of the pace that we live our lives at the moment. So it's really, really important to give this individual that you're talking to time to think through their thoughts and then express them to you. Then have courage. It's a really, really important one here. Try not to be put off if you get negative response. And remember, you don't have to fill every silence in a conversation. Some people may find it really, really difficult to open up. So it might not work for them if when you first asking them how they're feeling and exploring how they're feeling using these shush tips. Don't be put off by that. Do try again if you feel that somebody does need your time and that support. So just to summarize then, shush, it's a really, I love that one. You know, it really means it is telling me to be quiet and listen. So yeah, it's really great. It's in the conversation, you're trying to listen and support this individual. You're not trying to fix anything for them and give advice. And no one expects you to be an expert counsellor. Indeed, that's far from what we're trying to do with these active listening. You're just being a friendly listening ear. So just as a quick reminder, give them time, let them talk at their own pace, focus on listening, respect what this individual wants to tell you about, what they want to say, what they want to share with you, and use those open questions. And I think above all, something very, through the heart of Samaritans, we're not here to judge anybody. We're just here to give that ear to listen. And above all, be present then when you're doing your listening. So that's just a really, really whistle-stop tour through what we do here at Samaritans Training and Engagement Programs, and just some hints and tips for some really practical, active listening that everybody can try with friends and colleagues. So thank you very much for your time today.
Thanks, Susan. Yeah, Olivia, if you want to stop sharing for the time being. So I hope everyone's fired up now to take some action to support your staff and maybe your contractors within your own organisations. Following on from this webinar, Olivia is kindly going to share some free resources from Samaritans. In particular, there's a publication called Finding Your Way, which is it's about 30 pages long, but it's a really useful toolkit designed for anyone who's struggling or anyone who's supporting someone who's trying to struggle. It's available in English and there's also Welsh versions. We've worked previously with, like, for example, Pobble to do a bespoke version, and I'd be really happy to work with any of you on promoting your own version of the toolkit, but also if you wanted just the basic artwork to get some printed copies for your staff, I'd be delighted to send that on to you. The booklet itself contains information about the signs to look out for, things that you could do to help others and to help yourself, like relaxation tips and small steps. It talks about the importance of human connection, how to seek outside support. It also importantly contains templates for self-harm and suicide prevention plans, which can be a really important tool for people preventing them turning into crisis. It talks about the listening tips, as Susan's mentioned, and there's also a section on signposting. So basically sending people and suggesting other organisations in specialist areas that may be able to help them. We also have a series of posters available, and if you wanted to speak to me about putting those up around your sites and your schemes, I'd be delighted to help with that. We also have volunteers around the country. Up in North Wales, we have specifically branches at Rhyl and at Bangor. The volunteers go out and do outreach activities within communities, and I'm hoping that we can arrange some volunteer sessions to be run with your site. So please do get in touch. The volunteers will be able to give presentations to talk about Samaritans suicide awareness, how to look out for each other, and sort of the importance of peer support within community settings. I would really love to be able to set those up with you. So please do get in touch and put me in touch with your sites. With regard to the tenants, we're also running a series of webinars starting in March, where we would like tenant participation officers and tenants themselves to come and join one of these sessions so we can talk about some of the stuff that we've covered today. Obviously, we won't be trying to sell them courses or anything like that, but we will be giving them some really important information which will help them to support each other and build their own resilience. So your support with promoting the tenants attending sessions would be really welcome as well. We've pretty much finished now, but I would like to say that you can talk to Neil about anything that he talked about, Susan about inquiring about some step training courses, and also to myself about perhaps getting some volunteer sessions at one of your sites or any of our resources. You can get hold of any of us at the wales@samaritans.org address. And you'll see the QR code there, please. And I think Olivia is going to put the link in the chat.
Yep.
But if you can, please spend a couple of minutes just doing the evaluation, that would be very much appreciated. And we would love to have some questions from you, which can be put in the chat, or feel free to try and raise your hand if you would prefer to speak and ask your question. Over to you, Olivia.
Thank you very much, everyone. Yeah, I have put the link to the feedback form also in the chat, but there's a lovely QR code on there as well. I'm just gonna have a look at the chat now and see if we've had any questions come in. Lots of thank yous. That's fantastic. Can't see any questions coming up just yet, but just wanted to say, I mean, if you gain anything from today, I hope it's just to start having these conversations. And also, we had some questions last week sort of about supporting staff and the like, and I think it's really important to just emphasize as well that when we talk about these brilliant listening tips, which Susan has kindly shared with us, that also applies to supporting colleagues as well. You know, if you've had a colleague who perhaps has been dealing with quite an intense situation, you know, it's quite important as well that we all lean on each other for support, and you do take a bit of time to perhaps listen to that colleague as well and have them talk through it, because as I mentioned at the beginning, you know, it is difficult to deal with these things when they happen, and you know the after effects can be quite negative on your well-being. So that's a really important note to have as well. And please, please, please share the link around that I've put in the chat there about the other tenant webinars. The tenant webinars haven't had as much of an uptake as the staff ones, but we're currently promoting it out. And as we mentioned, they're free, completely free, accessible. So really want to get the word out as much as possible with that. A diolch yn fawr pawb. Thank you. And I will be in touch with the lovely handouts as well from the Samaritans. Okay, to leave this screen on. We'll keep an eye if there is anything else, but yeah, I suppose I'll embrace the silence to be a good listener now.
Embrace the silence.
Yes. Which I'm not very good at myself. Diolch pawb.
Oh, we had a lone part.